and welcome to Econolastic. I'm Joe,
and I'm Andrew.
So today's video is going to be all about the unemployment and the labour market. This video aims to explain the two causes of unemployment, these being disequilibrium unemployment and equilibrium unemployment. And in order to clarify the difference between these two, there's going to be a fair few graphs.
So let's first think about how the labour market works. And to do this, we're going to go to the whiteboard behind me and start with our first graph. So we've started out with the graph behind me. On the x-axis, we have the real average wage rate, and it's real because it's been adjusted for inflation or to take prices into account. And on the y-axis, this bottom axis here, we've got the number of workers, which we've just denoted as Q. What this graph currently shows is the average demand for labour and the average supply of labour, which is the total demand and supply of labour in the economy.
So looking at Andrew's graph, we can see the aggregate supply of labour curve, the ASL curve. This curve shows the number of workers willing to accept jobs at each wage rate and naturally slopes upwards. Now, think of this on a personal level. The higher the wage rate, you're more willing to accept that job.
Of course, yeah.
You may also notice that this line is fairly inelastic, which means it goes...
That means relatively steep at this point, doesn't it?
Yeah. This is because the size of the labour market force is unlikely to change overnight. Obviously, there's not going to be a big jump in population overnight, and there is a fairly consistent rate of which people enter and leave the workforce, which, when you think about it, is people retiring, or and then people on the other end of that leaving university, leaving school, and then entering the job market.
Despite what Joe's just said, you can see that the curve is not totally inelastic. It's not a straight line. And this is because the higher wage rate will encourage some people back into the labour market. So some examples of this, you've got people who might have been raising a family who now are enticed back into the labour market due to the higher wages. You might have some people that have been on a secondment or a sabbatical and have been travelling, and again, enticed back by those higher wages. And you may even have some people who have previously retired but think it's worth coming back, working a few extra years or however long because of those higher wages. The other reason is that the unemployed will be more willing to accept jobs at a higher wage rate rather than continue looking for alternative employment.
So again, looking back at Andrew's graph, we can see the ADL curve, which is the aggregate demand for labour curve, slopes downwards. This is because at a high wage rate, firms will want to cut back on labour and will want to substitute labour for other factors of production. So this could be, for instance, on a car assembly line where you've got people assembling cars and they'll try and switch it to actually machinery.
Yeah. So as you can see, I've now added a line here which represents the equilibrium wage WE. And this is where the demand for labour equals the supply of labour, the intersection point where you can see right there. Now, the labour market would experience a state of disequilibrium if there was a wage that was above WE, which I'm going to illustrate now. So at the higher wage rate of wage 1, which you can see on the graph now, we actually have an excess supply of labour over the demand for labour from A to B. And this gap here, A to B, is what is known as disequilibrium unemployment.
So for disequilibrium unemployment to occur, two conditions must be met.
The first one you can see on the graph behind you, the aggregate supply of labour must exceed the aggregate demand of labour.
Secondly, there must be stickiness in wages, and this means that the wage rate cannot immediately fall to WE. Which is known as the market clearing wage.
This can be due to workers being unwilling to accept nominal wage decreases. Put yourself in their shoes. If you were told for the same job, you're going to get paid less, you're not really going to accept that.
Nope. And the second is trade unions will often push back on these situations. So you had quite big cases for this in the UK. Quite a lot of trade unions will keep organising strikes to make sure that employees were not going to accept these wage decreases.
And lastly, employment contracts may already be in place. So if you've signed a contract, it might have 3 years on it, or you've signed a contract for X amount of years, you would have to renegotiate, or your employer would have to renegotiate that contract, and you're again not in a position, or you're not going to want to accept that lower wage.
No.
So even when the labour market is in equilibrium, say at wage WE, not everyone looking for work will be employed, as some people will still hold out to find that better paying job.
Yeah, and this will be illustrated by the next graph that Andrew's going to draw on the whiteboard.
So we've got a very similar graph to before. We've got the average real wage rate on the y-axis. We've got the number of workers on the x-axis. We still have the aggregate supply for labour and the aggregate demand of labour. The difference in this graph is we have this N curve here, which represents the total number of people in the labour force. Therefore, the horizontal difference, that is this difference right here, represents the difference between the total number of people in the labour force over those number of people that are willing to accept jobs. So that's the difference between C, people who are willing to accept jobs, to D, people who are just still holding out for that higher paying job.
So on Andrew's graph, QE represents the equilibrium level of employment. Therefore, C to D represents the equilibrium level of unemployment, sometimes referred to as the natural level of unemployment.
Something else you should hopefully be able to notice from the graph, if it's been drawn properly, which I hope it has, is that you'll see this N curve gets gradually closer to the ASL curve as the wage rate increases. And that's because people who are holding out for jobs or who are unemployed are going to be more willing to accept jobs at the higher wage rate, hence the two come closer together.
So in this final graph that Andrew's kindly drawn for us, we both show equilibrium and disequilibrium unemployment.
So at wage rate 1, we'll call it, we have disequilibrium unemployment, which we showed on the very first graph, from A to B.
Yeah, and equilibrium unemployment is B to C,
which we showed on that second graph.
Yeah.
And therefore, total unemployment must be A to C. So in this video, we've covered what disequilibrium unemployment looks like. We've covered what equilibrium unemployment looks like. We've covered what they both look like in the one graph. In our next couple of videos, we'll actually go through some of the causes of disequilibrium and equilibrium unemployment.
Thanks for watching this econolastic video. Please check out our other videos on YouTube that cover a whole host of economic topics.
Please also check out our website at econolastic.com. You'll find the link in the description, where you can find our step-by-step dissertation writing guide, and where you can also book myself and Joe for 2-to-1 tutoring.
Thanks for watching.
Thanks for watching.